She never wanted this marriage, but fate had other plans. As she walked down the aisle, tears streamed down her face. Marrying a man old enough to be her grandfather was never her dream. But what happened on their wedding night left her utterly shocked. The grand wedding hall shimmered with golden chandeliers, their glow reflecting off the crystal glasses and silk-draped tables. Every seat was occupied by elegantly dressed guests, their conversations a mixture of admiration and gossip. But amidst the lavish decorations, expensive floral arrangements, and the sound of a classical orchestra playing in the background, the bride stood frozen. Her heart pounded as she clutched the bouquet in trembling hands. The weight of the heavy bridal gown, embroidered with delicate pearls and diamonds, felt suffocating. She could hear whispers from the guests, murmurs about her youth and innocence, and how unfortunate she was to be bound to a man more than 4 decades older. Her eyes, already swollen from endless crying, remained downcast as she was led down the aisle. Every step felt like a chain being tightened around her, trapping her further into a life she never desired. She tried to block out the pitiful glances, the forced smiles, and the judgmental stares. At the altar stood the man she was about to marry, a billionaire whose wealth was known worldwide. Dressed in an expensive black tuxedo, his presence commanded authority, but his aged features told a different story. Wrinkles lined his strong face, silver strands mixed with his dark hair, and his sharp eyes, though observant, carried a hint of sadness. As she reached the altar, she dared not look up. The priest's voice echoed through the hall, reciting the sacred vows that should have symbolized love and devotion. But to her, they felt like a sentence. "Do you, Eleanor Grace, take this man, Alexander Blackwood, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her throat tightened. The silence in the room became deafening. Every eye was on her, waiting. Her hands clenched the bouquet harder. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she couldn't. A single glance at her father's stern expression in the front row reminded her of why she was standing there. This marriage was not for love. It was not for happiness. It was a transaction, a deal to save her family from ruin. Her father's business had collapsed under debt, and Alexander Blackwood had been the only man willing to help. His condition: marriage. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she whispered, "I do." A hushed murmur spread through the crowd. Alexander's voice followed, deep and steady. "I do." The priest's declaration sealed her fate. "You may now kiss the bride." Eleanor flinched, her breath hitching as she felt his hands gently lift her veil. For the first time, she met his gaze. His expression was unreadable, no triumph, no malice. Just something distant, something she couldn't quite understand. The kiss was brief, barely more than a brush of lips. Yet, it sent an unfamiliar shiver down her spine. The room erupted in applause, the sound ringing hollow in her ears. The reception was grand, yet Eleanor felt like a ghost moving through the crowd. People congratulated her, their smiles either fake or filled with pity. Alexander remained by her side, his touch never forceful but always present. As the evening went on, Eleanor barely touched her food. The weight of the night pressed on her shoulders, making every breath feel heavy. The thought of what awaited her after the celebrations sent a fresh wave of dread through her. Finally, the moment came. The guests had left, the music had faded, and she was led into a luxury car, sitting beside her new husband in silence. The drive to his grand estate felt endless. When they arrived, she was ushered into a beautifully adorned bedroom. Candles flickered, casting a golden hue over the silk sheets and velvet curtains. Her heart pounded harder. This was it. Her wedding night. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe as she heard the soft footsteps approaching behind her. Then, his voice broke the silence. "Come." Unexpectedly gentle. "We need to talk." Eleanor turned, her wide, fearful eyes meeting his. Alexander looked at her, not with desire, not with hunger, but with something entirely different. Understanding. She was not prepared for what he was about to say. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she faced Alexander. The weight of her wedding dress felt heavier now, as if it symbolized the burden of this union. The grand bedroom, adorned with gold and velvet, should have felt luxurious, yet to her, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. Alexander stood a few steps away, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, studying her. Despite his age, there was an undeniable air of power around him, a presence that demanded attention. But at that moment, there was no arrogance, no expectation in his expression, only something calm and unreadable. He walked toward a chair near the fireplace and sat down, unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket. He didn't move toward her, didn't touch her. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling slowly before speaking. "You're scared," he said simply. His voice was deep but lacked the force she had expected. Eleanor stiffened, her fingers gripping the fabric of her gown. Of course, she was scared. How could she not be? She had been forced into this marriage, bound to a man she barely knew, and now she was in his home, in his room, completely at his mercy. She swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. "What do you want from me?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, as if the question amused him. "That's what you've been thinking about all night, isn't it?" She didn't answer. Her silence was confirmation enough. He sighed and ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I won't touch you." Eleanor blinked, uncertain if she had heard him correctly. "What?" "I said, I won't touch you," he repeated. This marriage was never about that. Her confusion deepened. If not for that, then what was this marriage about? She had spent weeks dreading this night, terrified of what would happen once she became his wife. Yet, here he was, sitting across from her, speaking as though none of those fears were warranted. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then, why did you marry me?" Alexander studied her for a moment before he stood, walking toward the grand window that overlooked the vast estate. His hands slipped into his pockets, his shoulders slightly tense, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "You think I wanted this?" he asked, his tone measured. "That I forced your father into this arrangement for my own pleasure?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond. That was exactly what she had thought. Alexander turned to face her again, his expression unreadable. "The truth is, I needed a wife. Not for love. Not for companionship. But for protection." Her brows furrowed. Protection? From what? A small smirk appeared on his face, though it lacked humor. "From people who want me dead." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. This was not what she had expected to hear. Alexander continued, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I've built an empire, one that many would kill to control. Over the years, I've made enemies, competitors, people who would do anything to see me fall." He let out a dry chuckle. "And the easiest way to attack a man like me is through his weakness." Eleanor felt her hands grow clammy. "And you think a wife makes you less vulnerable?" He nodded. "A wife changes everything. It forces people to reconsider their strategies. It makes them believe I have something, or someone, to fight for." He paused before adding, "It makes me look less like a lonely target and more like a man with something to lose." Eleanor's mind spun, trying to process the revelation. She had believed herself to be nothing more than a pawn in a financial arrangement, but this was something entirely different. "So, this is just for show?" she asked cautiously. Alexander tilted his head. "Not entirely." He stepped closer, though still maintaining distance between them. "You are my wife now, and that title carries responsibilities. You will be seen by the public. You will attend events. You will act the part of a devoted partner." His voice softened slightly. "But behind closed doors, you are free. I won't demand anything from you." Eleanor inhaled sharply. She had spent so much time fearing this man, expecting the worst, and yet here he was, offering her freedom within the very prison she had thought she was trapped in. "But, my father," she stuttered. "Your father got what he wanted," Alexander interrupted. "His debts are cleared. His business is safe. He sold you to save himself, but I am not him. I don't need to own you." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were the truth. Her father had traded her like a commodity, yet the man she had feared the most was the one offering her something close to dignity. She looked down at her hands, her thoughts tangled in confusion. "So, what happens now?" Alexander exhaled and took a step back. "Now you rest. This has been a long day." Eleanor stared at him as he turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked before she could stop herself. He glanced over his shoulder. "To my room. This one is yours." With that, he walked out, closing the door behind him. Eleanor stood in the silent room, her mind spinning. She had been prepared for cruelty, for control, for a man who would take what he wanted without question. Instead, she had been given a choice. And she didn't know whether that terrified her more.